Ta-da! It says we're going live. I never trusted at the beginning, but if Snowden has taught us anything, it's not to trust a lot of things on the internet. Welcome to the show, everyone. Let's put these in so that you can hear me a little better. Today, we are talking about Edward Snowden's memoir. I wish at a time like this that I could do a poll that was just like, hey, who's read this book? So that I can get a gauge of where people are coming from. This is the reading that I did on the book. It's quite extensive. Read it a few times. I'm not quite sure how to distill all of this into easily digestible format. My first recommendation right off the bat is if you have not read this book, go and read it. It is really, really good. I've got my dust cover down on the floor there. But this here is Permanent Record by Edward Snowden. And I think that it's brilliantly crafted for a bunch of reasons. And I'll go into those in a second. So, where I'm going to start on this, I think that if you have read it, you will probably understand why this is so important, because right off the bat, I mean, just in the first chapter where he's talking about the history of his family, and he's gone back, generations and generations and generations, or he's just talking about his childhood and playing video games, immediately you get this sense of what his philosophical view of the world is. And there are a lot of people in the world who have never been exposed to these ideas before. I think that for most people, they just their default is, well, the government is inherently good, they're going to protect us. A lot of people by default will go to the government to solve their problems. Oh, healthcare doesn't work, well, let's go to the government, let's fix it. Education doesn't work, let's throw more money at it from the government, let's put government even more in charge of this. So many areas of our lives, let's leave it up to government to regulate these tech giants that are spying on us. And I think that the message that you start to get immediately from this book is, don't necessarily trust the government because they lie to us a whole lot. And we go over a bunch of those lies. We go over some of the covert operations that have been going on. It's a lot to cover. So what I think I'm going to do with this, because I don't want this live stream to run too long, I have no idea how long this is going to run. So we will have to see about that. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through all of these different topics, and I'll probably do individualized segments on each of them, just as a topic in general, maybe making reference to the book. But this book really brought up a lot of points that I think are so important to us, especially in the digital age, that I kind of want to go into them in depth. So may not get to all of them in this live stream, but just so you know, I will be having more comprehensive videos come up. And this is sort of an overview for all of you. Maybe the book's too long for you and you just want an overview of what's in there. Maybe you want like favorite passages, quotables, things like that. Again, I highly recommend that you read it, even if you don't like thick books. It's actually super easy to read. It took me a couple of days. So, and I'm sure I could have done it easily in a day if I'd had a big chunk of time to put towards it. So on that note, where do I want to start? So let's start by talking about Bitcoin, because this is mainly a crypto channel focusing on tech, but blockchain tech in particular. Bitcoin's price, huh? Wow, a lot of people in the chat were mentioning that before we started. I'd been so immersed in this book that I hadn't even looked at the price. Giant plummet. Didn't Snowden just say the other day that his book and the DOJ's lawsuit was going to be good for Bitcoin? What's going on there? So I'm going to just mention crypto in passing, just as a segue into the issues of this book. So Snowden has talked about Bitcoin in the past. At the Bitcoin 2019 conference this year, I was lucky enough to MC it, which meant that I was lucky enough to introduce Edward Snowden to the internet stage. He came through on a Skype interview, and I've never been so giddy and nervous. I'm not a nervous MC, but I was just like, oh my God, like my heart was pounding, because this man's sacrifice and his intelligence and just all of that, it was overwhelming for me to have any sort of intersection there. I never got a chance to chat with him, but I did get a chance to say his name and have him take over the conversation. So that was pretty cool for me. But he mentioned at this conference the question. So David Bailey asked him, "Are you a Bitcoin hodler?" do you have any Bitcoin? And Snowden didn't answer, but he did say that when he first purchased the servers that were needed in order to get documents over to the journalists that eventually released them, he needed a way to do that. How do you purchase servers or anything anonymously without being caught? He opted to buy them with Bitcoin. So this was 2013 that this happened. Now, a lot of the coins that are currently in existence weren't in existence then. And for him, Bitcoin was a way that he could do this in a covert manner. Now, just a disclaimer there, one thing that he also has talked about in the past is that Bitcoin is not inherently private. And I think that's important to take into consideration. And once I go through the scope of some of the policies, which even shocked me, like I've been following the Snowden case for forever, like in detail. And a lot of the explanations of these programs were really shocking when he laid it out in this book. So we'll go over that. But one thing that is very clear is that, you know, it takes an enormous amount of effort to remain anonymous on the internet, and very few people will ever get away with it. You know, very few people will have the technical know-how to pull it off. So first of all, my pointer to everyone is just presume that everything you are doing at all times is being collected. So there we go. Nice jumping off point. I know a lot of you are looking for a cheery live stream. Da-da-da-da, you're being surveilled at all times. Probably not as cheery as you were after. All right. So, oh my gosh. Let's talk about some of the things about Bitcoin. So Snowden did mention it, Bitcoin 2019 conference. He's used Bitcoin to purchase the servers. He did mention that this book would be good for Bitcoin. Why did he mention that? It's because the day that it was released, the government decided they wanted to ban it. They decided that the information in this book was not information that they wanted the public to have, which should make all of you want to read it even more. Not just watch my summary of how it's going, but take a look at this book, read it, have a copy, and have a physical copy, because if they win the lawsuit, you can bet that this will be re-released and have a whole bunch of stuff redacted, shall we say, to keep this relatively clean for the air. So I would recommend having a physical copy of this book. I have not figured out a way to buy it using crypto at the moment, but maybe one will come up. Snowden's point in mentioning that this would be good for Bitcoin is the fact that the government was threatening to seize all profits from this book from him, which they absolutely can do if those profits are being, you know, if you paid for this through Amazon, you paid using your credit card, and the banks basically need to give you permission in order to use your funds. So, and that all goes into a bank account as well. So in order for access to those funds to be granted to Snowden, he has to be given permission by the bank, and you can bet that the government isn't going to give him that permission. So there may be a Bitcoin, like a more public Bitcoin option coming out soon. Otherwise, I recommend everyone goes to his website. So he is, of course, the president of Freedom of the Press. If you go to his website, actually someone in my Telegram group pointed this out, so hat tip to you, you will find a Bitcoin donation there. So if you're downloading maybe a free copy of this book from the internet, head over to that website, just give a crypto donation to that organization, because, and I'll go into this a little more depth later, they're doing tremendous work. They are educating journalists on how to create, you know, protected systems. They're teaching individuals how to use encryption properly. They are giving people tools for how to make their lives more private. And I'm going to go into that at the end, because that's a crucial part of what I want this live stream to be about. Okie-dokie. What else? I'm just looking at my notes. I have so much notes. There's so much I want to share with you guys. This book I think is profoundly important. So one thing that he did talk about a lot in the book, keeping on the side of crypto and cryptocurrency, but also cryptography in general. So he talked about privacy. He talked about the need for encryption. Obviously, cryptocurrency, crypto comes from the encryption of the currency, and he just drills home the fact that encryption is so tremendously important. That's one of the solutions that he comes up with. Again, I'll mention that again at the end, and maybe do an entire video on tools that he offers for keeping your lives more private. That includes heavily encrypting everything you do. So I'll talk about that in a bit, but he talks about privacy. He talks about zero knowledge. explains how that works. I know that this is a term that gets thrown around in the cryptocurrency space a lot, and maybe you don't quite understand what that means. I think the book really breaks down the definition in a really comprehensive manner. And it also breaks down how the internet functions really, really well. Like I just at the start of this book, let's see if I could just pull it out very quickly, which I probably can't because I have trillion tabs in here. All right, so it's not going to be a quick one, but basically he goes over all of the different protocols that the internet sits on. So my understanding of how the internet works is probably not that comprehensive. And then you read this and he talks about like the time protocol and the email protocol and this other protocol, all these different methods that are operating. Like we think of the internet as this cohesive thing. He really breaks it down into all of these different protocols. There's like all these different things are happening at all times. And that's all the kind of information that people could potentially intercept. And as we later learn, do actually intercept. So talks about like encryption and how that's super, super important for protecting that stream, that outflow of information, and also protecting any digital device, because you can presume that every device of yours is insecure. And again, I'm going to go into detail about exactly what programs he mentions. And then finally, he talks about money. And I tweeted this out yesterday because he says that, you know, he became allergic to credit cards. And I like the way he phrased that. He's actually very funny in this book. I had some laugh out loud moments, but he talks about credit card purchases. And once he started to wake up to the incredible level of surveillance and tracking that was taking place, he just stopped using credit cards altogether. He started using hard money. He said he bought everything with cash or hard money. He mentioned at the conference he bought things with Bitcoin. He doesn't actually mention Bitcoin explicitly in the book at all, in case you're wondering. But he has made allusions to it in the past. He's tweeted about it a lot. So that's like he's talked about it in interviews. So that's important. And I'm going to go over some privacy techniques as well that you guys might keep in mind. But take everything with a grain of salt, because currently there are a lot of companies that tout their privacy focused companies and how good they are, and they're really good, they're going to protect you. None of this stuff is airtight, and if there's one thing I can drill home, it's that there are so many ways for governments to intercept and for companies to intercept data from you, and you should not be presuming that anything you're doing is private, no matter whether you're obscuring your IP address with a VPN or whether you're just using hardware devices that have never touched the internet, or whatever you're doing, just presume that it's inherently insecure. And if there are lots of privacy techniques you can be using, layer them on top of each other. And there's so much to do. Again, that'll be the end, because I want to break this up into Snowden's journey, how he came to these ideas, some of the biggest takeaways, and then his solutions at the end for all of this. So, me going into this book. Now, this changed my perspective a little bit. I have always had the idea, like I'm from a very freedom-oriented background. I have worked with a lot of, like, you could call them libertarian organizations. I don't really like to label myself anything. All, I agree with is that I don't like people forcing others to live the way that they want. If I want to live my life and not hurt anyone and not steal their stuff, then I should be basically free to live that life. I think the individual has the right to their own life. So I've won like Libertarian of the Year awards in the Friedman Conference, and it's just been involved with think tanks. Like I used to host the Learn Liberty Academy at IHS. So this is sort of my background. And I came into watching this book, and it's hard to convey these ideas of freedom to people, because a lot of people, as I mentioned at the start, they're just not interested. And so it actually goes into that apathy and about how that's how we got here. People just not caring about freedom. And I'll mention in a little bit about why that's a terrible thing, not just for yourself, but for the people around you. But when I first came into this book, my idea, like when I discovered cryptocurrency, I was like, yes, this is the answer. Like, it's a long game, but this is the answer. Because when you take away control of the money supply, you take back so much power that people have been holding over you. If you have elites in power who are able to, coerce banks into freezing your assets or seizing your assets or not allowing you to send it to certain causes, whether it's WikiLeaks or whether it's a legal marijuana dispensary for medical marijuana in a place whose state has made it legal, they could freeze that all the time, and they routinely do. So for me, taking back control of the money supply was the most important thing we could be doing as a society. But when you think about it, it's a long game, because essentially what you're saying is, if I start taking back control of my finances, well, immediately I get sovereignty over my decisions to a certain degree. And that's the caveat I'll go into. But second of all, you're presuming that you're going to take away a lot of revenue from the government. And this is something that Milton Friedman went into a lot. I actually did a video about this, about how he said, listen, if you start using money that is inaccessible to the government, you take away their ability to leverage funds, to take you off to wars, to operate incredibly expensive surveillance programs, et cetera, et cetera. And so as a long game, this is important for society. Make choices that give people back more freedom. So the thing that kind of got me was, I just didn't realize the scope of surveillance going on. You know, I'm not sure how you guys felt. Maybe you can tell me in the chat. Hi everyone who is here. Hi Jason. I think that when the news came out and we started reading about PRISM, and that's sort of the program that first comes off the tip of my tongue when I think about this, is like, oh, everyone knows about PRISM. We don't really know what it is. All we know is the government has the ability to coerce social media companies and telecom companies to hand over information about us. In my head, I equated that to, okay, these tools exist, and if the government ever has reason to go after me, they could potentially do that. It didn't occur to me that all this stuff was collected at all times. And there's literally a database, a very well indexed database that is easily searchable, that gives people any information about me that I have ever produced at any time. It's not just the potential that this could happen because they have the technicalities, or that it sometimes does happen, is that it is happening right now and nothing has changed. And it's this constant process that's happening. So let me explain a little more about what is happening to your internet traffic, because I think Snowden lays it out super well. So first of all, here are some programs that I'll go through. So we've got the FISA court system. You all know about like the secret laws and the secret wars and all the secretive things, and it's FISA that basically makes that possible. We've got PRISM, which is basically a program that allows the government to ask Google and Facebook and Twitter about any information that they want, and they routinely collect that information, like all information, everything you've ever hovered past in your timeline, just hovered, not even clicked on. Like I'll keep going. All upstream collection of data. The program Turbulence. We'll go into what turbulence is and how Turmoil and Turbine both operate as programs for collecting your data. It's crazy. And Quantum. You've got Optic Nerve. You've got Photon Torpedo. You've got X Key Score. So let me go into a little bit about what these programs are. So basically, in my own words, because you should go and, as I said, read the book and read about how this works. But basically, everything you type into a search bar, not just the things you press enter with, but even the keystrokes. If you start typing in, I don't know, Osama bin Laden, and then you're like, oh, I kind of don't want to search this, and you delete it. That stuff is still tracked, kept forever in a permanent record of you. Now, you think like, oh, well, if all this data is being collected, it must be really hard to sift through. So first of all, I'll go into how easy it is to sift through in a second, but let's talk about the Turbulence and Turmoil Turbine programs. So basically, everything you type in, everything that touches the internet, first of all, passes through what you can think of as this kind of firewall that the NSA has set up. And there's this program called Turbulence, which consists of two different programs. There's Turmoil and there's Turbine. And one of them is this passive collection, which means that everything that goes through the internet is first sifted through the NSA. Everything. Like, I can't stress that enough. Everything. I can't, I'm smiling, but if I didn't, I would cry. Every single thing, every phone call, every on a device that has a microphone, every conversation, like everything you do is being watched and passes through this system called turbulence. Now, he describes it as basically this big black box, which is like the size of a 4-shelf bookcase, and you get passed through this, and then an algorithm goes through it, looks for any keywords. Maybe, you know, you're looking up protest, or maybe you're looking up Middle East, or, you know, whatever keywords they have are trigger words, and then either it goes passively into collection and gets stored in this database forever, everything you've ever done, or it triggers this other program, which is an active program. What that does is it basically attaches a little bit of malware to whatever you're looking at, and sends you to the website that you initially queried, but with that little bit of malware. And that goes into your computer. You just think you're arriving at the website. It's like, oh, great, I'm at my website, I'm done. Now you have that bit of malware in your computer, and now they have access to every digital thing that you've ever done on that device. That's terrifying. That's absolutely terrifying. And not enough people are talking about this. And thanks to Snowden, we know about this, but we've known about this since 2013. And this has been going on since 2013. And it's taken this book for people to really understand the scope of what was going on. And even now that the book has been out, what, like a week, since Monday last week, I think it was released. I'm sorry, we're not at all concerned that literally every thing the microphone is picking up from all the devices around your home is being stored forever and is being logged with all these keywords. So let's talk about how the government searches this, because you think, oh, well, you know, this isn't helpful because this is just this database filled with all this noise, and then probably never even going to check it anyway. So they have this program called XKeyscore. Now, XKeyscore works kind of like a Google search. In fact, it was built by Google. Thanks, Google. Now, one thing we have Google to thank about is that they built the best web search tools in the world. They, you know, if you compare, like, I love DuckDuckGo and I only use DuckDuckGo now, but I have to be honest, it doesn't search with the same, you know, fine-tuned search results as Google, because it doesn't keep all the data you're searching for. Whereas Google tracks everything, it understands your habits, it has all this metadata, it has all this really smart AI machine learning that is figuring out like what exactly you're looking for based on every interaction you've ever had with the internet in history. So they have the best search engines out there, and they built a search engine. For better say, thank you for doing that, Google. So great. And this search engine basically means that if you have an IP address, if you have a phone number, if you have a name, if you have a physical address, whatever you want, you just type it into this search engine, and instead of bringing up usual websites the way that normal Google works, this program called XKeyscore will bring up every private email you've ever sent, every text you've ever sent, every microphone recorded conversation that has ever been stored. It will bring up all of those and allow people to just search through it. Absolutely terrifying. Oh my God. Oh my God. Okay. So there's that's going on, which is just like comprehensive. And again, I'll go into more detail, some of the programs later on, or maybe I'll do an entire video because this video is going to get way too long otherwise. One other thing that was shocking is that the government has screen recording. So once they have that malware in your computer, and you know, if you've been triggered, if you looked up the word protest and that triggered something and sent them a thing, the government now has screen recordings. So they can go back through their database and look at your screen as if it was you looking at your screen. So right now, the government most likely, especially considering how much I've been tweeting about Bitcoin and, you know, privacy and surveillance and Snowden and permanent record and all of that, they probably have access to my desktop exactly as it looks right now. So I've got my Zoom application, I've got my, you know, YouTube box there that shows me what's going on in the chat, and I can respond to people. I've got CoinCap open because I'm looking at the Bitcoin price as well as we're going. They literally can watch a replay of everything happening on my desktop, everything that I did. They have screen recordings of this. Okay, so that was new information that I did not realize, which is also terrifying. So the other thing that he pointed out, and this is kind of this hypothetical that we've been playing with for a long time. We think about, oh my gosh, what about the possibility of someone in the NSA being bad, and maybe they scroll through someone's phone and find private photos, and maybe someone sent a raunchy picture to their loved one or not so loved one, or someone they wanted to be their loved one. The idea that they might have access to that was always a little scary to people. It's a different reality when suddenly he just starts talking about, now not only is it a possibility, but it happens on a routine basis, and it's a currency of exchange used within the NSA at this level. So he mentions in this book this scenario where he's sitting down with co-workers, and this was kind of coming to the end of his stint with the government, where he's kind of like, oh my God, everything is under surveillance, everything is monitored. He's kind of flipping out, and he wants to understand how this apparatus works. So he goes into this new division and starts working with these people who are tasked with finding assets and spying on them. And they will just be, sharing nudes of the asset's wife, just sharing them around on the internet. So it's not just a possibility that this is happening. This is actively happening with anyone who is ever being looked at, or anyone, they're saying that, people are looking at their ex-girlfriends and trying to find dirt. This isn't just a possibility that this is happening. This is absolutely happening. He talks about, there are lots of phrases, and I'll go through and organize them in subsequent videos, but he talks about how, the intelligence community has kind of been taken over by people who were just on the tech side, and there was this flood of hirings that happened, a lot of it, most of it contract work that happened, and that's what's filling all of the surveillance departments at the moment. But what happened is these people were just given the keys to the kingdom. They had these tools, and they're given very little oversight. In fact, he says that hardly anything at the NSA is even encrypted. Now, if you think about how scared we are in the cryptocurrency community of handing over information in KYC stuff and letting the banks have this treasure trove of information that keeps our name and our date of birth and our address and all of these things that could be used for identity theft, and how badly they keep it. There are always hacks at JP Morgan. There are always hacks at Citibank. All these companies do not have a good track record of keeping that information safe. Now you think about the amount of information the NSA has access to. When I say NSA, I mean hundreds of thousands of workers, maybe even a million people. We don't actually know the scope of work that's been contracted and then subcontracted and then subcontracted again, and how many people have access to incredibly, secretive information, incredibly sensitive, I should say, information. But it's insane that all these people have access to this information, and also insane that Snowden says hardly any of it is encrypted, which means this is not very well protected stuff that is just sitting there, that the government is collecting and then creating this storehouse ready for people. So that's another really scary thing that I just kind of wanted to mention right off the bat there. Now, the solution that he has to all of this, as I mentioned at the start, is encryption. And he says some really interesting things. So you think about the way you use your device, and you probably use the delete button a whole lot. You're probably like, oh, this is a document that I don't want, so I'm going to delete it. And he explains, and this is probably something that most of you already know, when you delete something, it doesn't actually get deleted. It just kind of gets hidden in the directory, so that your computer says, oh, it's no longer there. The file actually hasn't moved. It's just the directory link that gets you there that has been removed. And that's what you're essentially deleting. What happens is it kind of goes back there and says, and it's now reclassified as, oh, you can eventually overwrite this data. But it takes a lot of overwriting in order to actually get rid of that data. So one solution, he says, is, instead of deleting things, because deleting things is like a NSA's dream situation, you should be encrypting everything with super, super high level encryption. Now, if you don't know how to use encryption, you guys need to check out the organization that Snowden is the president for, which is the Freedom of Information Institute, I think, yeah. And they have courses, they have tools for helping people. They have great articles that says, how do you choose a good VPN from a bad VPN? I'm going to be going through those articles and distilling that information for you as well. But now Snowden's primary focus is giving people tools to reclaim their privacy. And one of the reasons why he's giving those tools to the individual is because we can't just rely on government and say, oh, Facebook's spying on us. We need government intervention. We need government to take over from what Facebook's doing. No, the government's been encouraging what Facebook has been doing all of this time. They have been leveraging what Facebook's been doing. They've been reaping the benefits without a lot of the costs of Facebook collecting all this data. They relish the idea that we're voluntarily giving away all of this information. So they're not going to be helping us. The people that need to be helping us are ourselves and us taking a more active role in our lives and our choices that we are making. So he talks about cryptography. Highly recommend all of you learn about that. I'm going to be taking a lot of courses in that and going to be passing along my knowledge as it comes to me. There are already some things I could probably pass on, and I'll be making videos about those. But cryptography is something that we knew was a solution a long time ago. Back in the 90s, you had what you called the cypherpunks, which were a group of people that were fighting the government about encryption. Now, the government considered encryption at that stage to be this tool of espionage, and they wouldn't let people encrypt things, which basically meant that they wouldn't allow people to have anything private in the digital world. This would have meant that we couldn't have, phone calls on the internet. We couldn't have transactions on the internet. The world of e-commerce as we know it would not have existed were it not for encryption. So the cypherpunks knew this. They fought the government. They won at that time. And now we're seeing, again, this sort of renaissance of this cypherpunk war where the government is going after encryption again. And again, calling these tools of espionage. They're talking about putting backdoors in phones. They're talking about putting backdoors in devices. You have countries like the UK and Australia, they're mandating that all encryption be hackable, that there are backdoors and everything. They have millions of dollars of fines against any company that doesn't comply, and they don't let those companies operate in their country. So they're opening the gates to all these people to hack our information. So again, there's been this renaissance of this cypherpunk ethos that your individual sovereignty can be maintained by using tools like encryption. They believed that code was a tool that would give the individual back control over their lives. And this remains true today. This is something that Snowden really tries to bring home in the book. And he talks about how you need to be encrypting everything. Instead of deleting something on your computer, encrypt it and then encrypt it again and then encrypt that again, if you actually don't want a record of it, because no one can access that unless there is some bug in the encryption, and you should be looking to the community that really understands this stuff to be keeping abreast of any malware found in any of that, or any hacks or exploits found in any of that, because the government will use those exploits to take your stuff rather than tell you about those exploits so you can protect yourself. So that gives you an idea of where their priorities lie. I mean, encryption, obviously, we already use that for our money in the cryptocurrency space. So that's something that we need to be probably applying to all areas of our lives. Now, what happened since the 90s? Like, if the cypherpunks got in the 90s, that we need to be protecting our online lives, that we need to be protecting our privacy. Where did that go? When did that dialogue stop? And suddenly we're just not talking about, someone's mentioning in the chat, if they're tracking keystrokes, then they know the encryption key. Absolutely. You need air-gapped devices as well. And that's all advice that you'll be given if you look into this stuff. When I say air-gapped, I mean devices that have never touched the internet. There are lots of tools that they recommend. So I highly recommend just going and exploring all of those. So what did we lose along the way? And this is something that Snowden's book is just brilliant at, and was one of my favorite things about when I read it. Is that he talks about the internet of the early 90s. He talks about the early internet and how different it was from today. He says it's the closest thing to what is it? I want to get this quote actually exact. So let me say. All right, I'll find it in a second. Yeah, I'll find it in a second. But he basically says it's the early internet was the first sense of freedom that he ever felt, like true freedom. He says that it was the closest thing to anarchy working in the real world that he'd ever seen. It was this place without rules. It was this place where all interaction was just peer to peer. There was no one with their overarching view, or technocrats or elite people in government overlooking that and trying to force any decisions on you. The early internet, like one of the most beautiful things about this book is how he describes the early internet and his relationship with it. And that's what the whole first part of the book is about. And it's so beautiful because it doesn't hit you over the head with these ideas and with this distrust of what some of these institutions are doing. It allows you to continue through the journey of the book as Snowden continued his own journey. So when he was young, and he made certain choices, his family had always worked for the government, so he had this idea that, well, yes, I need to work for the government. If I love my country, I need to work for the government, and that will help my country. And then it sort of shows his evolution as he went to the army, he worked for the NSA, he worked for the CIA, he worked as a private contractor for all these institutions as well. And you go along the journey in the same rate as him. You start to uncover things as he uncovers them. And that's a beautiful thing to watch in this book, because I think, as I said, a lot of people have never been exposed to these ideas. And the way that he gives analogies about the early internet, about his childhood school experiences, about analogies with, people from 100 years ago that he provides, and with analogies that he gives about the gods and mythology, all of this works to give you a hint of why these same principles should be applied to our everyday lives today. And it's just a beautiful unfolding. I think he's an incredibly clever writer. Obviously, he's an incredibly clever person, because he was someone who just was so technically proficient that he had access to all of these things that no one else did. And if they did, they certainly didn't report any of them. So just incredibly gifted man. And I think that he's a gifted storyteller as well. So I highly recommend reading those. But I did want to go through and talk about, like, maybe just read a couple of passages about how he describes this early internet. And again, I put too many tabs, so I'm gonna have a hell of a time finding them. Internet change. Okay, so here's one of them. I don't know if this is the best one to read. We'll see. So in the 1990s, the internet had yet to fall victim to the greatest iniquity in digital history, the move by both governments and businesses to link as intimately as possible users' online personas to their offline digital identity. Kids used to be able to go online and say the dumbest things one day without having to be held accountable for them the next. The early internet's disassociative opportunities actually encouraged me and those of my generation to change our most deeply held opinions instead of just digging in and defending them when challenged. This ability to reinvent ourselves meant that we never had to close our minds by picking sides or close ranks out of fear of doing irreparable harm to our reputations. This felt like freedom. Like that it really struck me. As it turns out, that was a great passage to read, but I think they're all great passages, which is why I marked them. But I just think that that's such a great passage, because he really describes, he's so atmospheric when he describes the freedom of his early days, where he's corresponding with everyone on the internet. He's learning how computers work. He's learning about nuclear physics and reactors, and he's learning about all these things. And he would have like dozens of pseudonyms that he would use, and he'd be playing games under all these other pseudonyms. And that flexibility of identity helps people grow up. Like, I think a lot of people talk about these days about how sorry they feel for children who have, again, this permanent record of their digital lives. Oh, I got a super chat from Uvis. Thank you so much, Uvis. I really, really appreciate that. And it goes towards helping support my channel. Obviously, Google takes 30% of all of this and tracks your donations there. So if anyone wants to send me crypto, it's in my link description on a lot of my videos as well. But one thing, it's beautiful the way he creates this understanding of what the internet was like back then, and the freedom of a child to just live their life and make mistakes. When I was a child, there was no digital photography. Every photograph I have is a physical copy. That's kind of, makes me feel good. Like, not just like that there weren't screenshots, because like we didn't get a computer for a long time in my family. So there are no digital screenshots of things I was doing on the internet. not necessarily bad things, but just things that might embarrass a child or might make them subject to bullying. You know, maybe I looked up the definition of a word that was an obvious word and it makes people think that I'm dumb, and maybe that gets leaked. You know, there could be all these seemingly innocuous things, but this permanent record of a person's history or how they've grown, how they've learned about the world, how they've evolved, that, you know, Snowden also mentions this idea of like a person in flux, that we're creating a permanent record of a person who is in constant flux. I'm not the same person I was 10 years ago, even 20 years ago. It's completely different. Like even reading past journals of mine, and I read it and it's like, oh my God, I used to think I was so cool. I'm like the least cool person I've ever met. Like it's so cringeworthy reading this stuff. But this permanent record that people have access to makes it seem like this is the person we always were. We're going to be held accountable for decisions we made a long time ago, no matter whether we've changed our minds or not. Like this is part of the legacy that this surveillance system and this permanent record that the government's created is creating for us. So it's a little bit sad. He then goes on to say, you know, in the new millennium, internet technology would be turned to very different ends, enforcing fidelity to memory, identarian consistency, and so ideological conformity. Now, if we think, like a lot of people have hypothesized about how did we get here? How did we get so polarized? How did the internet become this polarizing tool? A lot of people talk about, oh, it must be the filter bubble that these organizations create, where you go on Facebook, you only ever read things you already agree with. Mute buttons allow us to just block out ideas we don't like. All of that obviously plays a role, but I'm starting to see another side of it here, is the inability to reset, the fact that our digital identities are controlled and linked to our actual identities, and it doesn't allow us any flexibility in being a human being. And as a human being, you're constantly learning, you're constantly discarding old beliefs. Hopefully, as you get more information, you're discarding things potentially and coming to new beliefs as you have information that supports other ideas. So one thing that, you know, even in the crypto space, like we'll dredge up tweets from 8 years ago, and I know I'm a victim of this, and we hold people accountable to things they've said in the past, and we think that they're a liar or untrustworthy if they no longer, if they're now disavowing those things, as if a person doesn't have the ability to change their mind. And that stuff is crazy to me, and it's really sad just thinking about the next generation, thinking about your children. What's going to happen to your children in this world? You know, they're going to be forced to conform to a single identity that they choose at a very young age and are expected to maintain, lest they be, you know, lest they be accused of being this inconsistent person, which all young people are. We're all inconsistent, and hopefully we gain consistency as we learn more about the world. So it is kind of scary the way the internet has changed. And again, there are chapters and chapters and chapters about how the early internet worked, the philosophy behind it, why this was the superior system, and why the NSA's dream, which is their ultimate dream is permanency, a permanent record. They want to capture every bit of information. They want a treasure trove, like a database that stores all of that information, and they want it to exist forever. How does that change society? Is that something we want in our society? God, no. If you think that that's a good thing, then we'll have to have a one-on-one battle. It's an absolute tragedy, what's happened. So how do we get back there is a really good question. And, you know, as I said, a lot of people call on government to fix problems, and that's not the issue. Like, that's not something you can do when the government is the perpetrator here. They're the ones collecting. And one thing that I really will drill home, like, it seems that Snowden really likes his country. He's a very patriotic person. He likes the people. He wants to protect the people. And he makes a big distinction between the government and the country. And he thought that when he was younger, going and serving his country meant going and serving the government. And it took him a long time to realize that the state and the country were two different things. And I think a lot of people conflate that. In fact, I've had a lot of very patriotic people watch my show in the past and get angry at me because they're like, oh, why do you not like what the government's doing? You're so anti-state, you know, why do we hate this country? And it's like, they're different things. And the state, he goes on to clarify, and he talks about the deep state, and he talks about how his parents essentially were workers for the deep state. Now, how do we conceptualize deep state? Well, we think of this underground cabal of these gangsters and dark people and this sinister environment. They're just the normal everyday people. They're just the bureaucrats that make up most of the way society functions, that don't turn over as each regime turns over. So these people, whether a Democrat or a Republican is voted in, they keep their job and they just continue to work and do the same thing that they've always done. And this is what we now refer to as the deep state. And yes, it dredges up all these sinister ideas, but it's sinister because of what this means. The people working there, they're just normal people. He calls them normies. They're just these normal people. And that it kind of leads me to this other point, is that when we think about the deep state, or when we think about all these sinister things that happen, like I think of the book 1984 and Orwell's idea, and how we use the term Orwellian to describe this sinister state of society where everything is tracked and monitored, and how would, we would never possibly let our society get to that state, where everything is monitored and tracked, and you have no freedom of speech, and if people want to get you on anything, they can, because they have this reservoir of information, and they'll just persecute you because they hear everything. Like, we think in our heads, no, our society is great and it's shiny and it has new tech products, and I have a high standard of living, and chocolate abounds. You'd look at all the bad parts of these Orwellian nightmares, and the rationing, and the dystopian chaos, and all of this, and you think, well, our society is far removed from all of that. We're not going to be in one of those surveillance states anytime soon, because the people wouldn't allow it. I think what this book really brings home is that we are there, and we need to stop pretending that a dystopian Orwellian society means everything shrouded in darkness, everything sinister, everything, the deep state being this underground cabal. Like, all of these things exist. All of our data is collected. All of our data is stored. All of our data is easily searchable. All of our private, most intimate communications are routinely shared by these members of the deep state as, just innocuous fun for them. Our stuff is just handed from person to person. Our private photos, our private thoughts, they're just shared as currency. And we are there. So the question is not to fight back against this idea and try to convince people, oh well, we are being monitored, and try to convince them about this. This is fact. You've had courts that have proven this now. You have courts that have proven that this is unconstitutional. You have courts that have proven that this is against the law. This is the outcome of the Snowden revelations, that these things were actually able to be taken to court. And Snowden, in the last chapter of his book, talks about all the progress we've made since then, and especially in the court system, where they're now talking about this, and there are now actually investigations about this. So the question isn't wondering, is this stuff actually happening? All of this surveillance is happening. It may not be in the form of, a giant dark screen with an angry man above it watching you, and that the computer is watching your every move. It's in the form of, maybe there's a screen recording of my computer right now. They're recording everything. I don't doubt that I've made a search query that has been intercepted and there's been malware, because Snowden says this happens routinely. This is just part of an algorithm triggered by any number of seemingly innocuous trigger words. So we need to stop pretending that this isn't happening. The next question is, now that we know that it's happening and we're in that sinister, completely monitored, completely tracked Orwellian nightmare that all of us were fearful of, what do we do? And he basically puts it up to individual responsibility. He talks about how, we have the Constitution that is meant to protect us from the government doing these things. What about companies that are doing these things? And that's something that there's a little bit of a difference in the way he talks in the book, and the difference between how he portrays himself in interviews. So in interviews, it's interesting how he's like, these social media companies need to be stopped. How do we stop them? La, la, la. And it almost seems like it's a call to action for regulation and all of that. The book makes me suspect that wouldn't be his first choice, because it seems like we're at a stage now where the deep state, the government itself, the head of the CIA, head of the NSA, the people who run IC, which is the intelligence community, they would not do a good job. in protecting us in this way. And as an example of why they wouldn't give a good job, I'll talk about his army experience. So there was this beautiful passage in the book where Snowden was working for the army. He was in training, and they were in this crazy derelict headquarters where the staircase was falling down, and it was completely like, it was a dangerous situation. It wasn't just unhealthy. It was really dangerous to them. And everyone who was there was complaining about it. No one knew what to do about it. And somehow Snowden was volunteered as the person to push back against this. So he wrote a letter, and he wrote it to his supervisor and said, listen, this is how we all feel. This is inadequate. This is against the law. This is all these things. And so he got called into his superior's office and said, listen, you just need to drop this. You know, you're going to be out of here in a month. This is going to disrupt a whole bunch of things. It's not going to even change by the time that you will leave here. So just drop it. There's no point. It's, you know, it's just this ongoing thing. And also, you know, that it's not that important for such and such a reason. And it became very clear to Snowden that the system was designed to disincentivize people to speak out about things that were unjust or wrong or anything. And all of his friends were like, oh, you know, you tried, thanks, whatever. And Snowden felt that he also got this vague sense of a threat where, you know, he was dissuaded from following this up. And so any normal person, any person other than Edward Snowden, probably, their response would be, okay, you know, that's not the cross I want to die on. That's not the thing that I want to go all out for and destroy my life for. But Snowden, being Snowden, in traditional Snowden style, wrote a letter to that supervisor, and then copied in that supervisor, and just went several layers up the chain of command to write about this. What was the consequence of this? This facility was immediately shut down because everything Snowden said was correct. It was, you know, and soon after, the staircase itself actually did collapse. Like, it was just, it was crazy what he was describing in this book about the environment they were in. And so, you know, everyone just hailed him, was like, oh my God, you actually got something changed. This stuff never happens. You know, no one reports this stuff. And the immediate consequence to Snowden was that he was called into his supervisor's office. And in that room were all these grey suits and all of the levels and chains of command that he went through for this. And they told him that his insubordination was a real threat and he was in deep trouble. And he was like, okay, but you know, this was a thing that was actually bad. Aren't you glad that I told you about this? And they're like, it doesn't matter that the thing was bad. What's more important is that you follow the chain of command. And Snowden said, I did follow the chain of command, and the chain of command failed me. I went to my supervisor and it didn't work. So what happens in a scenario where you're meant to go through this chain of command, but the system itself is flawed or designed to be completely ineffective? How do you operate in that scenario? And it goes back to the way people treat Snowden now, where they say, oh, he should have just gone through the proper channels. When those proper channels have been completely hijacked by the special interests, that's not a channel you want to go down. So he explained that to them, and he was again just told, no, you're insubordinate. This is not on. And so eventually he was like let out of the office, and apparently the last second, one of the ultimate supervisors called him back and said, now, Ed, I just want to make sure that we're not going to have another Ed Snowden moment. And that passage made me chuckle, like laugh out loud. Like, I don't think they could have even fathomed the major Ed Snowden moment that was going to come out of all this. It was just absolutely beautiful. And so just to kind of summarize and recap here, and as I said, I'm going to follow up and digest this into like how-tos and how programs work and kind of easily digestible videos for you all. But just to kind of end here, one thing I wanted to talk about is his analogy to the infantization of the population, the way that we're all kind of treated like children. And so at the start of the book, he has this great idea where he says, like, one of the worst things about being a teenager is that you're in this flux position where you feel like you're an adult and the adults feel like you're a kid. And so it's this very disempowering situation where you feel like you want to make decisions for yourself, but you know, the powers that be say that you don't have the capacity yet. And he says that this infantilization, although he doesn't call it that, is pervasive throughout society. The government deciding what's in our best interest, the government making decisions for us, and ultimately through that process, disasters strike. The same way in Greek mythology, where the gods come down in metal, you always know that a tragedy is going to happen. So I think that with this analogy of like his schooling career and his childhood, this is kind of what I want to wrap up with. And it's about how the system has failed us, and why we need to look for alternative means for protecting ourselves. So yeah, Uvers, I actually did notice that the chat had stopped chatting as well, and I was like, this is a first. Usually they're either trolling or they're fighting back, like whatever. I don't know what's going on there, but there are a lot of people watching right now. So hopefully you're enjoying this and it inspires you to go read the book. So in school, Ed first got his first glimpse of what it meant to be on the losing side of an imbalance of power. And obviously this is a metaphor that he takes on to refer to how a citizen should feel in response to their government. He said that he was scandalized, and he said that you think about the best way to run a society and you think, oh well, democracy, but then he says, if you're anything like me, you were barely entering double digits when you first started to wonder about politics. But he said democracy wasn't the place. Democracy certainly wasn't in place in my US history class, where if my classmates and I had a vote, Mr. Martin would have been out of a job. So he talks about his school teachers and about how it's this environment that has this huge imbalance of power. And, why don't the students have a vote in the class? If democracy is important and what the majority wants is important, why wouldn't they have a vote in the class, etc.? So he said that, if a teacher made a mistake and you brought it up, you would get punished. If a teacher, carried on with that mistake and you continue to push back, you'd be in real trouble. If, say, they promised a field trip to the Smithsonian Institute, but then cancelled for an imaginary infraction, they'd offer no explanation beyond citing their broad authority and the maintenance of proper order. It sounds familiar, and it seems like exactly what the government does. And then he said, even back then, I realized that any opposition to this system would be difficult. Not least because getting its rules changed to serve the interests of the majority would involve persuading the rule makers to put themselves in a purposeful disadvantage. That ultimately is the critical flaw or design defect intentionally integrated into every system in both politics and computing. The people who create the rules have no incentive to act against themselves. What convinced me that at school, at least, was an illegitimate system. What was that an illegitimate system was that it wouldn't recognize any legitimate dissent. So what he's saying, and he goes on to say, is that our current system is an illegitimate one. It is a facially flawed one because, again, it doesn't recognize any legitimate dissent. You look at what Snowden faced as soon as he came out with his revelations. You look at what the chain of command would have been for him to share these ideas with the world. I mean, it is very clear that this is a flawed system that disincentivizes the people in power from changing anything and leaves the majority of people disempowered. And we have this pretense of, oh, well, I vote, therefore I'm to blame for whoever's in power. Like, oh, we get the government we ask for. We all get a say. It's like this imaginary say that people think that we have. It makes us have this semblance of authority or sovereignty in our own lives. The fact is that the system we're playing into is facially flawed. And I'm just going to read this one more time. Getting the rules changed, like let's say we as a majority said, okay, this is a bad system, this is not fair system, let's vote to have it changed. So getting its rules changed to serve the interests of the majority would involve persuading the rule makers to put themselves at a purposeful disadvantage. The people who create the rules have no incentive to act against themselves. So I will leave you with that in this stream, as we're running out of time and no one's going to watch a video that's over an hour. So again, I'm going to break this down into more easily digestible bites throughout the week. The weeks, I should say, is a lot to get through. So if we can't fight back against the system, if we can't say, well, let's get these laws changed, what do we do? we start making more proactive choices in our lives. We start using encryption for everything. We start using VPNs for everything, which basically encrypts everything we send onto the web, gives you some semblance of privacy. We start making active choices in terms of what we use for money. If we're using cryptocurrency, making sure that we are using money that is private. If there are privacy tools available, we need to be using them. It's really important because it doesn't just affect you, it affects everyone in the system. The more people that use these things, the more private it gets. So if you say, well, I don't need to use privacy, you're not just making an active choice for yourself, you're also making an active choice for the people around you. So think about that when you're making your choices. If using privacy coins or using coin join or cash shuffle for BCH or Wasabi for BTC, or any number of these tools that are available to us, if you're not using those, ask yourself why, because you're putting at a disadvantage all the people that are trying to remain private and taking away their ability to do so. So just think about it. It is an active choice. It's not just a matter of saying, oh, I'm just inaction is fine. Inaction is still a choice that you're making. So think about that. Think about using cash more often instead of a credit card. When you're in a store, I know a piece of plastic is a lot easier, but cash is, again, going to ultimately give more people more privacy. There are lots of tools we can be using. I'm going to start going through a lot of those and give people ideas for how to protect themselves. But we're in an era now where we are in this Orwellian surveillance state. That's something we just need to come to terms with. We need to be making active choices as a society for how we're going to be moving forward in this world, how we're going to be living our lives, because the legacy that we leave behind, it doesn't look good for the next generation, where it may just be taken for granted that the government could be collecting all of this information. It could be just taken for granted that everything is monitored. We've already descended so far, we don't want to descend further. So I think that it's imperative that we all make more active choices in our day-to-day life. So on that note, guys, I love you all. Thank you so much for watching. Read the book. Read the book. There's so much I wanted to go through. Some great analogies with like mythology and all kinds of things, like the schoolyard, how it works. Really in-depth explanations of how some of these systems work, so you can get a better understanding of how mind-boggling it is. Go read the book. Go donate to the Freedom of Information Institute that Snowden is the president of. Donate in crypto so it can't get seized. Spread the word about this book. Do whatever you can. Go and protect yourselves. That's all I ask. Scary times. All right, love you all. Have a wonderful rest of your day, whether you're tuning in the afternoon or the morning or whenever. Go enjoy yourself. Bye. Oh, and thank you to Uvas for the super chat. I really appreciate that. And again, that helps me to keep my channel going so I could be going through this information and letting you all know about it. All right. Goodbye.